All right, this is a video on how to adjust valve lash. A lot of people call up. We get calls almost every day. People saying, hey, I don't know how to adjust my valve lash. And so when you break your motor in after about 20 hours, you're going to need a valve lash adjustment. Just because the motor expands and contracts with heat and whatnot. So your torque specs on the bolts are going to can vary and can come loose. It's also good to check this at least once every 20 engine operating hours and keep it tight. However, on these small little motors, they are a little bit different than on your typical hydraulically adjusted or hydraulic lifter motor. These are solid lifter motors, and it's a single cylinder engine, so it's while it's straightforward, it can also be a little bit complicated if you're not familiar with the way they're adjusted. First thing you do is you're going to pull your spark plug, and that should be pretty obvious, but I'll show you anyway. So we're not worried about top dead center and bottom dead center on these motors. All we really care about is the actual valve location relative to the other valve. So let's remove the spark plug. You're also going to remove the valve cover. Use a 10 millimeter spark plug on this guy. Should be a 13/16. Okay, so as you can see, you have two valves, intake and exhaust valve. The intake valve is wide open, or it's on the open part of the lobe, the highest point of the lobe, or fully open. So with these motors, you want to set your exhaust valve with your intake all the way open, and vice versa. Your intake valve with the exhaust valve all the way open, as in all the way open on the ramp. So we're going to move the motor around until we get one of them on the completely open ramp. So in this case, the exhaust valve is all the way open, and we'll set our valve lash for the intake. Okay, so what we have to do now is we have to set this valve lash. So the valve lash, essentially what it is it's space between the tip of this rocker and the top of the valve. You can see right there's some lash. It feels a little bit loose to me. So in order to measure it, you're going to use one of these tools right here, which is called a feeler gauge. And they're labeled as to what size they are on them. The one we're going to be using is 5 thousandths. 5 thousandths is a safe number to set your valve lash at. It's recommended between 3 and 5, 5 being on the high end. I normally stick with 5 thousandths just because it's easier that way. It's simple and easy, and you're not really going to see it, and you're not going to notice the difference between the two. So if we stick this in here, we can see that the 5 thousandths feeler gauge is loose fitting, so it's too loose. We have to tighten it up. So the way we tighten it up is we're going to loosen. I've actually already loosened these for the video, but you're going to put a 14 millimeter on the large portion, the large adjuster nut, and then you're going to remove the lock nut, which is a 10 millimeter. So when you do that, you can adjust your valve lash, by turning this in, turning your main adjuster nut in. So what you should do is you're going to turn it in. You're going to where you just start getting tension between the valve and the rocker arm, and then you get it nice and tight to where you actually have to apply some force to get the feeler gauge to come out. And then usually that's where you want to be. When you do tighten these together, it's going to move a little bit, so keep that in mind. You may have to do a little bit of trial and error to get it to where you want. Typically I'll leave the feeler gauge in there. I'll put my 14 on the adjuster nut, lock down, and then check it again. In this case, it's a little bit too tight, it won't come out, so we have to back it out. You can safely back it out by using a 14 and just backing it, turning it just slightly. That usually releases it where you set your valve lash, like that. So that one's done, the intake's done. Your 5 thousandths there, you can see it's tighter than it was before, but it still has the space it needs. Then you're going to rotate the motor over so we have an intake valve completely open, and set your exhaust valve the same way. So the exhaust valve itself, you're going to do the same exact operation for, and then you're going to put it all back together. Valve cover and spark plug. So we'll set this one. This one's actually perfect. This one does not need to be adjusted. This exhaust valve is exactly 5 thousandths. So this one does not need adjustment, but I will go ahead and tighten that one up anyway. There is a torque spec for these lock nuts. For the video, we're using an impact, but usually you have to follow a torque spec. Let's loosen that up a little bit. Too tight. Right at 5 thousandths. Valve cover goes on. Make sure not to pinch the gasket. There's an O-ring gasket around it. If you pinch it, it will leak. And when it leaks, it makes a nice mess. And then we get phone calls saying that your valve cover gasket leaks, when in reality it's just pinched. It's going to be kind of tricky. Once again, 10 millimeter. Tighten that. And insert your spark plug. Refer to all torque specs in the engine user manual. But in a nutshell, that is how you set the valve lash on a 460 engine. These are the tools you're going to need. 10 millimeter, it can be on an impact if you like, but we prefer on a hand torque wrench. Spark plug wrench, 14 millimeter open end wrench, and a bunch of feeler gauges.